everyone. Thank you, Torsten, for a very nice introduction for the fun of building the ecosystem. And I'm sure we all have a pleasant experience to share with you all guys and maybe give some hints and try to use our time on stage very wisely. So I would like to ask you guys to introduce yourself, but from the role your organization is playing in the ecosystem.
All right, well, thanks. Sorry, I'm taking the mic of the moderator already. Thanks, Anna. Good morning, everyone. My name is Don Ginsel. I founded Holland Fintech about 5 years ago as an independent body to facilitate fintech developments across the whole financial ecosystem. And we're doing that with quite a strong European reach at the moment. I'm happy to share some lessons today.
Hello, yeah. So my name is Bibiane Kaufmann. I am happy to represent the Austrian Financial Market Authority and its Fintech Contact Point today. The Fintech Contact Point is our innovation hub, a venue that we already created 2016, and that acts as internal and external platform for all our information exchange within the authority, as well as for fintech requests of market participants, or more general for building a dialogue with fintechs.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie. I'm coming from Brussels today, and I'm representing a different animal, which is an association. So Savings and Retail Banking Group, 110 members in 80 countries, based in Brussels. And I always say we have 2 hats, 1 salary, which means, you know, we do regulatory, Brussels, which is something that you would expect. So everything fintech, digital, regulatory, but the second hat is business, so strategy exchange. We work with the banks and fintech startups to collaborate on new ideas, on best practice sharing in different workshops and work groups.
Good morning, my name is Boyan, I'm from Raisin. Well, basically, a few words about Raisin. We are the leading marketplace for savings and investments across Europe, and we are a participant in the local, of course, fintech ecosystem in Berlin, where the company is based, and also quite active on a European level, I would say, because we are promoting not only the local fintech ecosystem, but the understanding that Europe might be a single market going forward, a real single market.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, Raisin is around in 24 countries, is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's at least what the Google says. And I would like to ask you, what's the role the ecosystem played in the Raisin's journey? You started, as you mentioned, in Berlin, so it's Germany. How did you go forward? Did the ecosystem players help you, or could you share any success or failures in that?
Sure, happy to share. Actually, the idea of creating and launching Raisin happened, I think, around 7-8 years ago. So we were a bit born before the fintech ecosystems in a way, and the regulatory sandbox and support was in place. But a funny story, actually, because always as a startup, the first funding round typically involves friends and family, and a lot of the friends of the co-founders, which are McKinsey alumni, were of course McKinsey. So the ecosystem of McKinsey kind of helped Raisin launch. Going forward, I think right now, being quite a developed company, what we do for the local and I would say European ecosystem is that first we try to, of course, mentor the companies that are around us that we know. Often we are also an investor, like we are placing funds. Last investment we made, for example, is with Yonko. It's a FinLeap venture that will be a new marketplace in Germany competing with, let's say, Check24. So we are mentoring, investing, also quite often partnering with new companies that are launching. For example, good example would be our partnership with N26. They're not really a newer company. We launched pretty much the same time, but we work actively with them, so helping them provide better products for the customers. Of course, they help our distribution. So partnership is something we do. And on a bit regulatory representative level, also our CEO is part of the Fintech Council at BaFin, so the German regulator. So we're trying to share our ideas, what can be done to improve further the fintech ecosystem, I can give you a small hint, let's say. A topic that's not super popular right now, but it's painful, is that, for example, in Germany, or I think probably in Europe overall, it's quite hard to share the growth and the benefit of the growth with your employees. What I mean is that it's relatively hard to issue shares, to distribute shares to the employees, and of course taxes are crazy on the shares. So it's really hard to attract the right talent when you really want to scale and develop. I know it's maybe something that's not that well known, but it's something that we're facing.
How do you face that challenge? Do you go and look for like a partner in the ecosystem, or, like you rely on your partnerships, or you just look through it? Like, is there any way you fix this particular issue through the ecosystem? Like the ecosystem. In like probably Don will support me in that, because he is building the ecosystem for around 5 years, right? So they're this week, there's the big party, and then they've been uniting all the ecosystem players and actors to work together and help the startups to start with, and all the other players to collaborate.
So I think, I think there's always a lot of support available, I think, from very different angles. And I think that's at least the idea that we had from the starting 5 years ago, is that in the end, there's indeed a lot of support you can actually bring as fintech companies to each other, because you're having a lot of similar struggles. But actually there are a lot of agents around it that actually are willing to help as well. Think about law firms, think about consultants that might have, like McKinsey, for example, have some background, might be able to support you on some levels. But to a certain extent, it's also really learning together. And I think that's what we're at least trying to do for the last 5 years, to see, okay, fintech's actually, I think, a very poor label for a type of company, because it's completely non-universal, and it could be anywhere throughout the financial value chain in all different shapes and sizes. So I think it's much more actually about the change of the financial industry altogether. And it actually includes all current actors. So that actually means that all the banks, insurance companies, but also the advisors, the regulators, they're all in the same game of this change. And I think that's what we found very fruitful over the past 5 years, is to bring everyone together around getting a grip on that change and trying to make that practical from their perspective, whether that's about being able to regulate it, or whether that's about basically finding a way to sustain your business for the future, right? So I think that's where there's a lot of sharing to be done, and well, happy to basically see now that over 550 companies are actually in that game and willing to work with that and share.
Yeah, and we had, like Natalie, you're having few roles in the ecosystem. One is the working with the banking association. And how did you see this developed? How the bank changed their role in the ecosystem? Was it because that, from my experience, they started to first look at the fintech startups from one perspective, and now it's changing. But could you share your perspective on how you've seen the journey since you worked in between, more or less?
Yeah, I think what is important is that also fintech, the definition changed. It's kind of what Don already said at the beginning, and I think that's why it's super important to think about how we define things. At the beginning, fintech was banks versus fintech. Fintech, the strange animal, fintech, this new thing we need to understand, what is disruption. So we had a lot of workshops, and our work groups were a lot discussing about disruption, what is it, how is it affecting us. But that was maybe 4 years ago. And now it's much more about fintech is also us, so also the banks. So fintech as technology-enabled innovation in financial services, and banks can also do fintech. So not only, so fintech is more an activity than a style of a company. So this is how the view has changed, and it has become much more policy-led as well. Because at the beginning, there were a lot of discussions about business and best practice, strategy sharing, how do we incorporate different innovation perspectives, how do we collaborate with newcomers, fintech startups, but now it's a lot also about how can the policy framework support us. So how can there be a fintech policy framework and a level playing field? So what I heard before by Thorsten, I don't know where he's sitting, Thorsten Thein, sorry. So I found it very interesting that you said Austria has this same business, same rules, same risk perspective, so the level playing perspective, but they're also looking at the sandbox, which I wouldn't agree, because And they're also looking at the sandbox. So the thinking now has changed a little bit. Let's create a framework, also policy-wise, where we can bring together the banks, the fintech startups, and maybe some of the totally new challengers from China, and see how we can foster an ecosystem where technology is supported by everyone, and where we look at the policy framework that kind of supports everyone and not only the newcomers. So level playing field and sandbox.
I'd just like to make a comment. We are still a startup ourselves as a FinTechMatters, and now when you start to talk about the Asia, and we're actually missing one panelist here. Harald, please come in. We forgot to invite you from the beginning. I'm very sorry for that, but you're very welcome. Could you please directly comment on our present yourself, your role in the ecosystem? I'm very sorry for that. And also comment your role in Asia and Europe connection.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is Harald Patt. I'm working for Fosun. Fosun is the biggest investment company in China. We have 600 to 700 portfolio companies and more than 100 billion asset under management. We are creating ecosystems all around the world. So, and what we do is in general is when we see a financial ecosystem, a good opportunity is that you can, sorry, I have a little cold, that the ecosystem in fintech has the opportunity to be also part of every other sector. Means when you see WePay or Alipay, that is once a payment, Alipay is an e-commerce company, and all the fintech services they added to their e-commerce. And with WeChat Pay, it is a communication platform between people, also including payment. These two companies cover in China 95% of all payments, which are done in e-commerce. So that means, and also more than 50% of all payments, no bank is included anymore. So what we see is, and we have the first time we see the big opportunity with PSD2 in Europe, also that we can create unicorns here in the payment sector, because banking and banks are totally separated now. Banks have all the regulatory issues, no margin, but are responsible for everything. And with PSD2, with the two licenses, you can take a totally customer takeover, providing services. If you own the chain to the end customer, you decide which service you can provide to him. So, and very dangerous for banks, not very fair, to be honest, but they also missed a lot of opportunities in the past. So we think that first time we have really a good opportunity in Europe to have this open banking or open API or PSD2, the opportunity to bring also fintech ecosystems to all different sectors.
Thank you. And Bibiane, from a regulatory perspective, how did your role change now when we are, basically we mentioned the regulations are quite important in the journey of any actor in the fintech ecosystem. How did you see it change, and what's sort of next challenge in that area?
Yes, I mean, since the beginning, we saw a role in accompanying fintech developments from a regulatory perspective. And when we started our innovation hub, the Fintech Contact Point, actually we already had two fintechs under a license. They were smaller mobile payment providers. So this same business, same rule approach came kind of natural to us, because we already saw that fintech is nothing that only is provided by startups. So we had a very broad understanding, and I think this helped us in getting a quick understanding of how fintech and banks and insurances can collaborate and interact with each other, because we already saw it in the tradition that we had on a smaller scale. But of course, when we started the Innovation Hub 2016, this was kind of a challenge accepted moment, because we don't have fintechs per se under our supervision. So there's a lot of happening in the non-licensed sector, despite some fintech models being run by supervised banks or insurances, and despite some fintechs working as outsourcing partners and being indirectly supervised, when you put it like that. But a lot of happening in the unlicensed sector. And we have a lot of variety of scale, of businesses, and of risks. So we always have this understanding that you can't regulate or even talk about the fintech sector per se, but you have to go back to think in boxes or in clusters. Yeah? When you take, for example, the payment sector, we saw a lot of beneficial developments for, I guess, I don't know, 10 years that everyone uses in our daily routine now. And the policymakers accompanied this, and they even enabled this by PSD and PSD2. So you can see this really as first European fintech laws. And the total different box or cluster would be the crypto asset scene, where you have at the moment discussions about alternative ways of financing, especially promising for small and medium enterprises. Also a technology that almost can help you in digitalizing everything, literally everything. Last week I learned that one of the most successful tokens at the moment is CryptoKitties, a token where you can breed and pet and sell tokenized cats.
There's a lot.
So yeah, literally everything. But we also see for years now crypto fraud on a daily basis. So we have mining pools, we have ICOs of fraudsters, we have crypto trading bots that really cause tremendous damages on a global scale, and that also other market participants that are serious have to deal with. So we never can get the fintech phenomenon by regulating it per se, but what we try to do is keep a regulatory neutral stance, not embracing every business model uncritically, because we think then we leave customers behind with their fears. And this is something also the keynote speaker before really made a good point on. Just to finish on that, this is nothing that is theoretical. I mean, Austrian policymakers felt urged some weeks ago to write a right for cash payment in the Austrian constitution. This is really something that shows this indistinct and tangible fears that people have, and that can lead to real hindering of innovation. So we see our role in accompanying innovation, so to make it sustainable.
Can I just ask you something about that? Because I was just curious about what you were saying about there's not so much going on in the regulatory field with regard to new entrants. What do you think is the cause of that? I'm just curious to learn a bit more about how you see that happening, and whether maybe because I do see a lot of regulators struggling with the fact that indeed taking the same approach to traditional players as to fintechs might seem very reasonable, but actually poses too high barriers to entry for smaller companies. So I'm just curious how you see that.
Barriers were kind of lowered already by PSD. So this is what I meant with there was a first European Fintech law created. So this was a discussion about how can you balance, how can you find a proportionate way, at least for the payment sector for fintechs. So I think in this area we also see a lot of regulated fintechs all over Europe, or fintechs that are at the edge of the regulatory sphere because they collaborate with banks. So they are kind of in the pool. But
what about the other collaboration? For example, now there are different ecosystem actors collaborate. It's not only about the fintech startups and the banks. Now we have a big techs, for example. Google now is partner up with Citibank, and Alipay also will open up their bank accounts to everyone outside of China. How would you see that as a regulatory perspective? Maybe also Natalie could also comment on that, because she's also working closely with EU Commission. So if you both could comment on that, different collaborations and it's completely different ways of regulations as well.
Yes, and there's a lot of also a very high indistinct fear for big techs. But we see them approaching in a totally different way. We have Apple, for example, which collaborates with a major Austrian bank at the moment. And we, of course, had discussions and discussions now about Libra and Facebook, who, kind of has collaborations with a lot of traditional market participants, like Visa or Mastercard, but now I think that's not the case anymore. But on the other hand, they try to be a flagship fintech model on their own, and they were not so fast in finding a dialogue with the regulators. So what we saw the last weeks is that if you come up as a global player with a global fintech model, then you cannot omit a dialogue with a joint force of regulators. I think this caused a lot of problems for the business model as such, and paved the way for many critical stances.
I would like to see all kinds of ecosystem players to be in Europe to be more courageous, meaning that a lot of the partnerships of banks with big tech companies we see in the US. We see them also maybe in Latin America and Asia, but in Europe we don't have that too much. So I would like to see also banks, financial institutions to be more courageous to think beyond their business model. That's from a business perspective. So to think, I don't know, how can I partner with maybe another bigger company to work in telco, to work in energy, to work in other sectors which expand a bit finance towards ambient banking. That's from the business perspective. From the regulatory perspective, I think there's a lot of discussions currently, and we will have to see how the way will go ahead, because there's two different ways of looking at it. One is towards what is the value of data. So there's a whole discussion going on, what's the value of data currently, and how do we strengthen European market players. So also in the Commission now, digital is with DG competition. So they might be looking at it more from a perspective of we need a lot of different players, whereas maybe DG Connect and DG FISMA connect more towards new technologies, FISMA towards financial services. They're looking more into how can we strengthen European players. And now in Germany, there's a totally new development now where the banks and this whole FinTech Council, so both the FinTech startups and the banks, have worked together on a proposal with the ministry to open up Apple and Apple Pay towards, or the Apple phone towards other providers. Mm-hmm. So there is some collaboration, for instance, of banks with Apple Pay, but so far it's always, we can only have Apple Pay. And Apple doesn't open up interfaces. And in the whole discussion of open data, what's the value of data? If banks have to open up data, what about other companies? Don't they also have to open up data and their interfaces?
It feels a bit unfair that fintech startups get a little bit of like a fast ride at some point. There's so many innovation sort of hubs or hubs and everywhere. But since I believe that we all align with their idea that ecosystem is a collaboration. So I would like to ask you and maybe give an examples of a successful collaboration between. We already touched a bit on the cases. Could you, for example, give any interesting, if you've seen or experienced a collaboration case between different actors in the ecosystem? Harald, please.
Yes. I think the big difference from the European landscape to China or to the US is that tech companies now decide with who do they collaborate. And I think Goldman Sachs didn't choose Apple to be the partner. Apple chose Goldman Sachs as a partner, and that is the thing that, and also Google is going to the offering accounts now, and also Facebook is seeing that there's a payment needs, and they think about Libra, which is in general a good idea. The question is if Facebook should do it. But all these developments in China are already happened. We are discussing it, and it's always a problem if you discuss things with too many people, then you never come to solutions, also not to a bad solution. You do not make any solution. And that is a big lag what we have in Europe, that we do not have tech companies which can partner to someone who can choose something. And if we're looking for data, which tech company has a lot of data and customer data? For example, for Fosun, it's very important to have end customer data. And our interest is not B2C because customer acquisition costs are too high. B2B to B2B is the end of low customer acquisition cost, but you do not own customer data. So best model is B2B2C. That you have the low customer acquisition cost and have scanned customer data. And now we are targeting 350 million people in one company with our investment companies. So, and that is data what we have. And our data can be used by our companies. So that is something which is important to come to the end customer data, but that's not the case in Europe.
It is a new value. But Boyan, do you have any comments on the collaboration? Because you've been even acquiring banks from your end.
We acquired the bank that actually was helping us to strengthen the ecosystem. But I would like to come one step back to the discussion about China and Europe. I think we are maybe not addressing the elephant in the room, and it's the scale of the European market ecosystem. And I think more effort should be probably placed in building a pan-European ecosystem. So pretty much having quick access to each and every market, because as much as it's great to have local regulatory efforts to promote a local business, but I think we should start thinking about a bit globally about that, like really on Brussels level, European level, and really to have the ecosystem that can really promote the companies on a pan-European scale. So hopefully at one point we'll have a global companies, global players that can be a success story as Apple and Goldman, not to just discuss what's happening in China and US and be like what we're going to do in Europe. So I think, maybe the pan-European level should be opened as soon as possible. I mean, PSD2 was pan-European initiative, was great, and not only local initiatives. But coming back to our specific case, we acquired a bank. We want to strengthen the vertical. I mean, we could have partnered. We have partnered with this entity for like 6 years. And we just outgrew the capacity of the bank, so we acquired, and we're doing a total tech revamp. So we have a right platform really for our scaling across Europe. I mean, to access each and every market in a operation strong way, basically.
Sorry, just comments because you touched upon this European collaboration. I think. And it again comes to courage. I think now, 2020, 2021 should be the time where we should be more courageous. So banks should work more on interoperability. Different wallet providers and payment providers should work more on interoperability of P2P across Europe, on e-identity. We've been talking about e-identity and interoperability since so many years, and we're still not there. And then that's a business perspective. And then or even AI alliances. Why don't we work more with different ecosystem players on strengthening AI capacities in Europe? But then from a regulatory perspective as well, I think next year, the year to come, we need to be more courageous on cloud, on cyber, on AI, and on data. Yes. And what do we want as Europe? And let's not talk about national always, but let's think really on a European level. How can we interconnect all these markets to help both startups and banks to be competitive in this whole global innovation development?
But I think it's just funny to see that actually on a market level, I think everyone's willing to cooperate and is willing to open up the markets. But unfortunately, on a national government level, we actually see the opposite direction, right? So there's a lot of fear for change, and there's actually people are fighting Europe to a larger extent to actually retain local power, basically, for national governments, which I think that's the biggest hurdle, I think, internally. And besides that, I think, let's say, the courageous part about cooperation with tech companies, I really agree that indeed let's say, Europe has embraced America as the big supplier for tech for a very long time, and now we basically have to deal with these consequences that we actually don't have our own tech ecosystem, or at least it's nascent instead of full grown. And so it takes time, I think, before it actually evolves into something that's really usable and can actually give us all control. I don't think we should regulate it to become that way, but indeed the single European market is one thing we really, really poorly need to be able to also from a geopolitical level, be able to sustain our own data, sustain our own infrastructure. And that's still a big challenge, I think, given where we currently stand on a national policy level.
Yeah, we unfortunately have to wrap up the panel, and I will ask you all to comment very quickly. What are your trends you see in the near future for the ecosystem? We already touched base on a few, but if you could just leave a couple of words for our audience to think of after we wrap up. Boyan, please start, and we just go and leave just a couple. How do you see the ecosystem will change? What the role would, for example, the fintech startup will have in a couple of years? Would the tech will come in? Would, from your perspective, what are the trend?
Yeah, so what we see going forward is actually closer and closer cooperation. I really hope that indeed banks are a bit more courageous, because for a fintech company, bank is the natural distribution channel, to be very honest. I mean, you need distribution. We discussed B2B, B2B2C. I mean, B2C might be really dead end for the usual startup because it's really expensive. We know that. So I hope that the distribution side of this fintech ecosystem is also active and promoting these new ideas internally, because I think this would be probably the best way forward for both parts of the equation.
I would like to see more cross-industry discussions, both from the startup side and also investor side and bank side, and more courage at European level. So also, let's say, yeah, also the Dutch national regulator to not only look at their local or the Austrian one, but to say, what can we help at the European level? What ideas can we maybe implement and encourage everyone else to think about the European side?
Thank you. I'd say we will see a lot more digitalization coming from governmental level, from states, from state-closed institutions. We will see digitalized securities. We will have discussions around the European tips and the payment system, how they will react on crypto asset models like Libra, try to maybe implement something on the client's front end themselves that makes payments more effectively and instantly and less expensive, at least when not completely without cost, transferable. Yes, I think a lot of more digitalization from the state's view.
So thanks. I think it's been a nice discussion. I think I'm still a bit worried about whether the policymakers and regulators are able to keep track of actually that's going on fast enough. But I do want to really encourage everyone to go into dialogue with the regulators and policymakers to make sure they get a better understanding. Not per se about fintech, because I don't actually think that they should care, but they should care about the best digital infrastructure in Europe, which consists of fintech infrastructure to a large extent, but it's not just about payments, insurance, and everything around it. But let's say the world has become digital, but I don't think that policymakers have recognized this yet. And indeed, it's really a cross-industry discussion that we should be having, because fintech empowers logistics, production, consumer goods, anything that's being made somewhere lies on transactions, trust, identity, security, which all relates to the fintech industry. So that's the call as well that I would do. It's probably in a couple of years we won't be talking about fintech anymore. It will probably have a new name. I'm not sure yet what it will be. We can start a lobby. We can do a poll maybe later on. But at least I think while we're still learning, let's get all the people that are basically keen on learning together to create already this European network that works and scales and help everyone do business across Europe. Because I think we have to wait for the policy. It might be too late, but let's work on all sides. Thanks.
Yeah, good point. I also think the question is bigger. It's not only fintech. I think we need a general mindset shift in digitalization and technology. And when we see how many companies from different areas, from software companies, they want to build cars now. They go to health, they go to surgery, and all these things, because finally it's a machine learning, it's AI, and all these things. So, and I think in Germany, and I think same as in Austria, we do not have the digital capacities because we do not educate our children very well in this area. So, and so we need to have and regulatory is something which is more prohibiting. So the US is more tech open, and also the Chinese, and we are taking care about data protection. We don't have any data, but we can take care what are the other countries doing with our data. And then they should pay taxes on our data. And these are the business model we create are not very long lasting, in my experience. So if we don't have any money anymore, the tech companies are not interested in serving us anymore. So yeah, I think also to add that fintech is something which is, finally, it's always a checkout process. So payment has to be done, but no one buys something only because of payment. Money I need because I want to buy something. It's always a need, the payment. So fintech is something which will be integrated everywhere, and it should be very seamless and frictionless and very convenient. But yeah, but for that we need an open infrastructure. And only to add one thing, that we have that we work together against Apple to open their API. The banks are prohibiting the fintechs open their data to them, and now they are looking. All the others should give their data and should give access to the end customer, but they do not the same on the fintech side. So that is not a very fair game.
No, it should be two-way streets
Sure,
all the time.
Sure. And they are sitting on data since 50 years doing nothing.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of work to be done in the ecosystem itself, and the European as well as the scope. So I hope you all get some insights, and we all here to the conference and network. I'd like to welcome. Thank you all my lovely panelists here. Thank you very much for sharing the insights, and yeah, I give stage to David back.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot to Harald.
Thank you.